When my partner and I were thinking of having children, it was really two stages. The first one was to think about whether we wanted to have them at all, which took a while for us. Once we decided we wanted to have children, we were open. We had the options of having them naturally or having PGD IVF, where they do a genetic makeup or workup of the embryo before going through IVF, and so you have the chance to screen out any embryos that have the mutation, so that you can be confident that when you have the baby, that baby doesn't have HD. I think a lot of our decision around IVF, choosing to go through IVF, was about the kind of people that, or personality type that we had. And one of the things that I'm really about is that I like to try to take as much control as I can. It's a sort of a personality thing for me, outside and inside sort of HD. But I feel like for me, having the information allows me to make a decision. And so for me, the IVF was a preferred option because I felt like I could try to take some control of the outcome about what would happen with my children. Also growing up, also growing up with my father being sick, and knowing that I was going to get sick too, I felt it was really important for me that that didn't happen for another generation, and that it was going to be hard enough for my kids to watch me, and that sort of what I could do for them was for them not to have to go through that. And so IVF seemed to be the best option to get me those results. Going through IVF is really complicated and draining for anybody, because a woman has to have a lot of injections and a lot of hormones, and there's a lot of medical procedures that you have to go through, and it's really quite invasive. And so anyone that goes through IVF before the Huntington's goes through a tough enough time. There's also no guarantee that you will get pregnant even if you go through IVF, so you might have to do that 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times before you get pregnant, even if you do. So those really draining periods of time, and then the added extra of the Huntington's was something that was just like, at the time, felt like a bit of a kick in the pants, because it was hard enough to get the embryos and get them ready, and that you're going to put them back in and all those things. But then the scientist comes and tells you that of the, say, 8 embryos that were ready to go, that they're going to have to take out 5 or 6 or, of those, because they had the mutation. And so for all that work, you end up with maybe 1 embryo, and of course you might not get pregnant through that. So IVF is really tough, and then with a PGD it becomes particularly tough, because at the worst time that you're feeling emotional and a bit, uncomfortable anyway, they just find another way of, feels like kicking you when you're down. The other thing that happens with IVF is it takes a long time. By the time you go through the hormones and then the PGD workup, which has its own process, and then you have to try to go through cycles, and then maybe you get pregnant, maybe you don't, and then finally you get pregnant, and then finally, maybe you have the kids safely. It took us years between the time that we decided to have children and actually the result of having children. And all through that time is lots of ups and downs. So it was probably the most testing part of my HD experience so far in my life. I found actually the test to find out whether I was gene positive or not, and also telling my wife, stressful. But I think that for me, having a baby through IVF was the most stressful, because I felt that it was really unfair that I had to put my wife through, years of kind of mucking around, and that even though she was great through it, I must admit there was a time that I felt really guilty and really angry about HD, because I felt that it was unfair that for some reason it seems okay that if HD affects me because I can manage that, but when HD affects someone that you love, it's much harder. We ended up going through 4 cycles of IVF before we had kids. That was a really long journey and really complicated, because it's very hard to know when is the right amount of times that you go through IVF, and it's expensive, and so sometimes it's the money that makes a decision about whether you can go through it or not. But there's always the thought that maybe the next time is the one that you're going to have a child in. So we went through 3 cycles that took a couple of years, and we had some rotten luck during that time. Even with one of our cycles, had all of the embryos had HD mutation, and so they didn't allow, we weren't able to use any of them. And so by the end of the 3rd time, we were really at a low, because we had all these injections and procedures and emotions and effort, and it just seemed like there was no luck going to be, going to go our way. And then after the 3rd time, I think I felt at that time that I just wanted to stop, to put it past us, and to say that we had to go, and that it was not worth, keeping on going. There was time to move on to sort of a different phase, and but my wife was not sure, and then I think over the time we talked a lot about it, and she said that she really wanted to maybe try once more, and it took us a long time to think about whether we would do it, and eventually we had one more go, and we ended up with twins. I think having babies is really a very personal decision for people, and I'm not sure that I could give any advice to anybody else about whether they have children or not, because there's so many factors that come into it. Things about just whether you want to have children or not, that's got nothing to do with HD. There's a lot of Huntington's things that come into it as well. And then something like with IVF, that can be quite expensive. And so there's sometimes some financial things as well that all sort of join together to make you form whether you want to have kids or not. I think I would recommend IVF to people if they felt like that they wanted to try to have children without giving them the gene. It's really the only way you can do that. I think, though, my advice would be that it's really long and complicated and can be really, really difficult. For me, it was probably the hardest part of my HD journey. I found it very easy, not very easy, I found it okay to go through the testing because it was just about me, but with having children, it was also about my wife, and that was really hard for me. But I think, like anything, sometimes the result makes you then decide how that process was. So that for us, because we've ended up with some kids that are terrific, and they've added so much joy to our lives that when we look back at it now, it seems like totally easy and totally the right thing to do. But I know at the time it was really a long journey and really complicated. So I think that if anybody is thinking about having kids, I would recommend that just to take some time to really think about it and talk about it, and not rush, and just think about the time that's right for them, and allow yourself to change your mind or change your opinion halfway through, or whenever it feels right, if that comes to them, because what you learn when you're a year in or after a little while that you have so many different new thoughts, and so often that can change your mind. And so just allow the process to take its natural course and not to feel guilty or pressured to either have kids or not have kids, or if you do have kids, to have them via IVF or not, because it's your journey, it's your life journey. And in some ways, Huntington's doesn't have anything to do with that. You know, you have to try to have that journey yourself and then try to keep the HD stuff to the minimum.